guest today is Driscoll from UC San Diego, part of a panel on the war in Donbass. And you started your presentation by saying that you're here because you're interested in storytelling.
I did. I am interested in storytelling. The paper that I presented is about the stories that Ukrainians tell to each other, and we used a methodology that involves statistical analysis of large quantities of data from Twitter. So we weren't interested in all of the stories. We were only interested in a small subsample that we could make statistically legible using keywords. And we focused in particular on keywords that are meant to create discursive boundaries with the political community that you are trying to exclude from the conversation. You deny the premise of their legitimacy of their claims as you tell their stories. So words about fascism create one dictionary of terms that we use to make our inferences, and words related to terrorism create the other dictionary of words that we use to create our inferences. And so you can think about it as hate speech. You can think about it as no one uses these words in order to start a conversation that is meant to be a mature conversation. These are words that you use to share with your friends that you can't believe what's going on, and it's an extremist, emotional kind of language. But and Twitter speaks to all of that that's just what Twitter is. But that makes it convenient for us to analyze as a sample. It's an interesting kind of sample that didn't exist in conflict zones 20 years ago.
Can that kind of discourse reach out to people who are actually undecided as to whether they're in one camp or the other?
That's an empirical question, and I don't think we have the answer to it yet. The purpose of this paper wasn't to answer that question. It was just to speak about the fact that these different communities exist. Whether they're trying to actually evangelically convert people, or whether there's a quiet middle that could possibly be swayed by this sort of language, I'm agnostic. I personally doubt it. I don't think that that's actually how... From what we know about how social media works, and we don't know much because it's all so new, my suspicion is that these are actually hate speech bubbles, and that you have little echo chambers within Ukrainian society. But the fact that these echo chambers serve as a, it's an ecosystem in which militias are also forming and people are actually getting killed. So the presence of this speech, I think, does feed into the war, or at least it's a way to make inferences about what people believe as they talk themselves into going to war. Having a sample that skews young, skews male, is helpful in those ways. But I described these in the paper, which should be available online.
You said yesterday that if you see Ukraine, when you look at Ukraine, you see Georgia.
Well, that was just me admitting that there were people on the panel who knew way more about the specifics than I did. And that is true, by the way. If you want to speak to a Ukraine expert, there are many, many better videos to be watching at this conference. But I do know a good bit about Georgia, and I do fear that Georgia's past is, and Georgia's present is Ukraine's future. I think that there's a very real possibility of Donbass turning into Abkhazia, but with less secure borders and really big. And I think the language of frozen conflict is very premature. I think that right now the conflict is a long way from frozen. But in terms of possible settlements that I think would be sustainable equilibria, to use political science jargon, I am afraid that that's a possibility, and it's one that may become probable over the next couple of years. There's still a lot of other options. I'm not trying to predict that, but I think that because of my own point of view and the case that I know well, I can't help but see that as a possibility. It's one that I take seriously because I have a pretty good model of what it looks like.
You're a student of civil wars. Do we have a civil war in Ukraine?
Absolutely. That's not even controversial. A civil war defined by 1,000 people dead and 100 dead on the government side. It's merely a descriptive analytic category within the community of social scientists, but this would be a one in the data set.
What about the fact that half of the armed men that come from Russia, that we had Russian divisions in August and September and on Donbass territory?
You know, I think there's a real misperception about what civil war means, and we talked about this on the panel a little bit yesterday during the Q&A. This perception that it's only a civil war if there's not a foreign element in it, that would cut many civil wars out of the data set, things that we acknowledge to be civil wars, but they had a ideological Cold War element with advisors from one side or the other, or maybe they had more of a colonial war element in the decolonization phase. If you exclude all of the places where you have third-party interventions that are not exactly neutral blue hat third-party interventions, you're throwing out the bulk of the data that we would want to use to make inferences. So I think more damage is done to a civil conversation on balance by calling it a proxy war, starting the conversation by calling it an invasion, or starting the conversation by making reference to the Anschluss. I think all of those moves to start the conversation are more disruptive to a mature conversation than calling it a civil war.
Thanks so much, Jesse.
No problem.